perfectly competitive markets, very highly assessed topic area, and let's start with the key characteristics. Number 1, small number of buyers and sellers. So no seller will have any dominant market power, and that links very well to another characteristic. Number 2, no barriers to entry or exit. So that states sellers can easily leave and enter the market without losing out on things like sunk costs, economies of scale, all the barriers to entry we covered in a previous video. Thirdly, homogeneous goods. All that means is all the goods are the same. Number 4, perfect information. So every single buyer knows the prices of all the sellers in the market. So there is symmetric information between the buyers and the sellers. Lastly, the one that linked to number 1, if no seller has any dominant market power, this means they are price takers. So they take the prices which are determined by the market and they have no influence over it. Now, looking over these main characteristics, they're quite extreme, especially things such as no barriers to entry or exit, so absolutely zero barriers to entry, then characteristics such as perfect information, which is very hard to achieve in a real market, and since these characteristics are so extreme, it's not very realistic for this to operate in day-to-day life, therefore we call perfectly competitive markets a theoretical concept, and all that means is that it could not exist in the real world. But just like in a previous video, I gave you an example of agricultural markets are a very good comparison to perfectly competitive markets, and there are many others such as foreign exchange markets, or you may know them as Forex. And why is Forex so close to perfectly competitive markets? This is because of a few characteristics. Firstly, in the Forex markets, there are many buyers and sellers. Then secondly, the main pitfall for markets that want to be compared to perfectly competitive markets is usually that their goods are slightly differentiated. But since in Forex, they are selling currencies, there's no real way to differentiate currency. Therefore, they are in fact selling homogeneous goods. Thirdly, due to the nature of the internet, it means in Forex markets especially, information is widely available, but we cannot say it's exactly like a perfectly competitive market. Why? Because the Forex market, just like every single other market, will have some sort of degree of barriers to entry. Now, even though they might be very small, it still does not align with the perfectly competitive market theory of no barriers to entry. So, now you have a good grasp on perfectly competitive markets and monopolies, it's appropriate now to learn about the spectrum of market structures and what that looks like. So as you can see, there are 4 gaps here and there are 4 market structures we need to fill in. So on the left side, we have perfectly competitive markets first, then monopolistically competitive markets. And if you remember back to an earlier video, the way I used to describe monopolistically competitive markets, or the way I used to remember monopolistically competitive markets, is just that it's a realistic version of perfect competition. Then in the third slot we have oligopolies, and lastly at the polar opposite end of the spectrum to perfectly competitive markets we have in fact monopolies. Now this means that monopolies and perfectly competitive markets are total polar opposites. Now them being total opposites is also shown in their characteristics. So for example, here we've learned that perfectly competitive markets will have no barriers to entry, but if you think about monopolies, for example, they will have very high barriers to entry, very high sunk costs, very high economies of scale, for example. So total opposite in even the characteristics. But now, to add a spanner in the works, think about technological change, so the introduction of the internet, and how this has brought monopolies closer to perfect competition. So almost moved monopolies a bit more left on the spectrum. So let's take the characteristic of information. So in monopolies, we'd say they have asymmetric information or just an information gap. But now, with the boom of the internet, we've seen sites such as Money Supermarket, Compare the Market, and these act as price comparison sites. They've allowed consumers to easily and conveniently compare prices between these massive monopoly firms, meaning now the information gap in the monopoly market structure has now been reduced and the market structure has now moved a bit closer to perfectly competitive markets. So these price comparison sites have solved the asymmetric information in monopolies, thus meaning monopolies characteristics are now moving more towards perfectly competitive markets, because as you know, perfectly competitive markets have perfect information. Now, technological change and linking it to market structures is always a very common exam question, but can also act as a great evaluation point to use when talking about the characteristics of certain market structures.